The P-47 Thunderbolt. To some it was a brute, a flying jug with stubby wings and a massive radial engine. But in 1944, in the dying embers of Nazi Germany's armored might, the Thunderbolt became something else entirely, a tank killer. This is the story of how a group of rugged, unrelenting fighter bombers brought steel giants to their knees, 86 tanks destroyed in just 48 hours. Not in theory, not in simulations, this happened. And it changed the battlefield forever. Let's set the scene. The Allies had broken through Normandy and were pushing hard into German-held France. The Wehrmacht, battered but not broken, responded with a massive armored counterattack. Dozens of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Jag-D Panzers poured into the Falaise pocket, attempting to blunt the Allied advance and buy time for a strategic retreat. But what the Germans didn't count on was what waited above the clouds. The 362nd Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of forward airstrips, was tasked with close air support over this sector. These weren't elite aces. These were gritty, often overlooked pilots who trained for ground attack, not glory. But their aircraft? The Thunderbolt was a monster, a 10-ton beast of steel and Pratt & Whitney fury. It wasn't built for beauty, it was built for punishment. And on August 7th and 8th, 1944, that's exactly what it delivered. Flying low over the bocage-filled French countryside, P-47s began pounding German tank columns with a relentless barrage of firepower. They weren't just dropping bombs, they were slinging death in layers. 150 caliber machine guns ripping into soft targets, high explosive 500-pounders cratering roads and bridges, and most terrifying of all, the newly mounted HVARs. These high-velocity aircraft rockets were the true game changer. Each one packed the explosive punch of a 105mm artillery shell and could punch through tank armor from above, the weakest point in any armored vehicle. Thunderbolts would dive in at steep angles, unleash a pair of rockets, and pull out trailing smoke and fire. Tank crews had little warning, no radar, no flak cover, just the sudden scream of an engine, and then thunder. That's how they got the name. The first day, the 362nd flew over 200 sorties. The skies were choked with smoke. German convoys were stalled on narrow roads, perfect targets for dive runs. The Thunderbolts tore through them like wolves through sheep. By sundown, over 40 tanks were confirmed destroyed or immobilized. Dozens more were left smoldering, tracks blown off, hatches flung open. And the P-47s, most made it home. Their radial engines could take staggering amounts of damage. One even limped back with a hole the size of a basketball in its wing, but the second day was even worse for the Germans. As the armored columns regrouped, the Thunderbolts came again. This time they were faster, bolder. Working in tight two-ship formations, one plane would make a pass to force anti-air crews to fire, exposing their position. Then the second would strike, silencing the flak with a precision rocket barrage. With the skies clear, the P-47s focused entirely on armor. By nightfall on August 8th, they had destroyed or disabled another 46 tanks, 86 tanks, gone in 48 hours, and that's not counting the fuel trucks, half-tracks, command cars, and infantry positions that were obliterated along the way. German commanders were stunned. These weren't strategic bombers hitting cities, these were fighters, once thought useless against armor, now rewriting the rules of air-ground warfare. So how did they pull it off? It wasn't just the Thunderbolt's rugged design or heavy armament, it was the doctrine. The 362nd and other fighter bomber groups operated under what became known as the cab rank system, a continuous orbit of aircraft ready to strike as soon as ground observers called them in. Using forward air controllers embedded with advancing Allied units, they received real-time updates and adjusted targets mid-mission. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in the skies of Europe, could do little to stop it. Most of their experienced pilots were dead or defending the Reich itself. What remained were green recruits flying outdated aircraft. Over Falaise, the air belonged to the Thunderbolt. This operation proved that the age of armored invincibility was over. The Thunderbolt became the template for what would later be perfected in aircraft like the A-10 Warthog. Heavily armored, armed to the teeth, and designed to support ground troops by smashing through steel. But back in '44, this was a revelation. Tank crews began to dread the sound of radial engines. Some abandoned their vehicles entirely at the first sign of Thunderbolts overhead. Others painted trees on the roofs of their tanks or covered them in foliage. Anything to escape the wrath from above. It didn't help. The P-47s were relentless, and after the Falaise operation, their legend was cemented in both Allied and German minds. They weren't just fighters anymore, they were tank busters. And for 48 hours in France, the battlefield belonged not to the tanks or the generals, but to the pilots of the 362nd Fighter Group and the roaring monsters they flew. The P-47 Thunderbolt, proof that sometimes brute force is exactly what wins the day.